Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to what we call Perspectives. Every Sabbath evening or Saturday evening, depends on where you're from. We have a program here for you at 6 o'clock. And on our program today, we're going to be featuring some special people who will be told to you later on. I won't tell you who they are, but I just want to welcome you. I'm very excited that you have chosen to be with us. You had many other choices, but you were very smart, smarter than your telephones. You were smart enough to know that this was the place to come to. And already the numbers are climbing. We're at 40, that's a lot. And we're moving right up. We're going as far as we can go. And I'm excited about this. I want to know more about my body and COVID-19. We're going to know more about that this evening. So welcome. And I'm going to ask Chris to even do a better welcome than I did. I know Chris is capable. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, folks, it's great to be here. It's great to have joined Pastor Wright in his church this evening. I come proudly, I'd say, representing Collaborate to Educate Our Sons, and we've invited our flock there also to be a part of this very critical program this evening. As Pastor Wright had shared, we're in the dilemma of sorts. We're in a low trust environment with regards to the vaccine, and there's a lot of information flying around that could undermine our health. And so we need to get it straight this evening. And so it's a delight to be here to actually share that. Let me give you a few facts as I introduce the topic. Here's the dilemma that we face. Black and Latino people in the United States died from COVID virus twice the rate of that of white residents. However, only a third of Black adults say they plan, only 2/3 of Black adults say they plan to take the COVID shots, compared to 80% of Hispanic and white adults. So when we're in this low trust environment, how do we get beyond it? Look to our shepherds. This is a time where our shepherds matter. We need to listen to trustworthy folks who invest in their lives day in, day out. Trust people like Pastor Wright, pastors, healthcare leaders who we know of. These are people, they've wedded us, they've dedicated our children, they've been with us in hospitals, and they do not want to lose one of us, not another one of us, because of fear or misinformation. One such shepherd that we have this evening is Dr. Bertram Melbourne. Lots of us call him Doc. He's a professor of biblical language and literature at Howard University Divinity School. He's also shared lots of other teaching roles at Columbia Union College, and I think West Indies College also. In addition to his teaching ministry, he has administered pastoral care in many churches. And he's currently in the chaplaincy program at Georgetown University. He's a prolific author of many books and articles, but one of his continued investment in people comes through Collaborate to Educate Our Sons, an interfaith nonprofit group dedicated to the education of our sons, making that front and center. How do we make sure that our young men succeed? I invite you to prayerfully, attentively give him your attention as he moderate this most critical event. Dr. Melbourne.
Thank you. Pastor?
Yes, let us bow our heads for prayer. Dear God, we thank you for this wonderful opportunity we have to share with those who have come onto this platform this evening. We're grateful that you have planted Redemption Praise Temple in this community and in the world community because of the technology we have today. We're grateful for the knowledge that you have blessed so many with, and those tonight or this evening who will disseminate the knowledge they have. We are asking you, Lord, to just touch their lips and give them the tact and the wherewithal and the know-how to deliver the message to us so that we can be informed, educated, and in some cases reformed. We pray, Lord, that everything that shall transpire here this evening will meet your divine approbation and that we'll be careful to give you all the praise. And in a special way, we pray that our moderator will be guided by you so that he will ask the right questions and we will hear the right answers. Thank you for hearing our prayer. This we pray in the name of the Father, the name of the Son, and the name of the Holy Spirit. Let the people say, Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Wright. Thank you, Chris. Good evening, everyone. Collaborate to Educate Our Sons is a non-profit, multi-faith organization that seeks to help boys and young men achieve their full potential. CEOS is built on a set of core values, including trust, faith, character, and service at local, national, and international levels. Its mission is to help youth achieve their full potential, and its vision is restoring balance to strengthen the global community. Why are we singling out boys at a time when women are just breaking the glass ceiling? That's a good question. And the answer to that question is that in 1949, 70% of college population was male. Today, it is around 36% for black boys. There is need for parity. These are the days of COVID-19 when black and brown males are being disproportionately affected. These are days of injustice when young black and brown males are being made to feel that their lives are at the mercy of others who either have their knees on their necks or shoot them causelessly with no consequences. Indeed, like Abner, they are dying prematurely, needlessly, causelessly, foolishly, and recklessly. This is a genocide that needs attention. Young black males need education when white high school dropouts are wealthier than black and Hispanic college graduates. And when black college graduates have a lower home ownership rate than white high school dropouts. And this is 2020 information. That is why CEOS has been doing its utmost to provide boys and young men, their parents, teachers, and mentors the best information to survive and thrive in these difficult days. And that is why we have sponsored this event this afternoon to give some education in this respect. Here are some ground rules. Our presenter will present for between 20 and 30 minutes. Then we will have questions. We are asking you to remain muted and to put your questions in the chat, and we will retrieve your questions from the chat. If and when the time comes that we will open the mic, we will let you know. But prior to that, please put your questions in the chat and remain muted, because sometimes we forget that we're not muted and we talk to somebody else in the house and everybody hears what's going on, and it can be disturbing. So we thank you for your cooperation on that event. Now, CEOS offers programs and services aimed at supporting, educating, and mentoring young men, their parents, teachers, and mentors, given the degree to which boys are misguided, misjudged, and their learning styles go unrecognized and unaddressed. We do this through issuing a quarterly newsletter, conducting workshops, delivering valuable training and correspondence, by awarding scholarships to worthy youth. In the last 7 years, we've given over 34 scholarships honored 30 persons and entities that have been showing exemplary work, and trained thousands of young men, parents, teachers, and mentors in the CEOS philosophy. In the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, we need this education. And I'm happy to introduce to you this evening an expert in the area. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Wayne Greaves. Dr. Greaves is a specialist in internal medicine and infectious diseases. He received his medical training at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and his training in infectious diseases at Vanderbilt University, Nashville, Tennessee, and at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. He has extensive experience caring for patients and conducting clinical research. Currently, he is a distinguished scientist at Merck Research Labs, focusing on development of new drugs for infectious diseases caused by viruses. Health literacy is one of his concerns, and he currently spends much of his time addressing numerous COVID-19 myths circulating on social media and simplifying clinical research findings so laypersons can understand. Our topic, Your Health is Your Wealth. What you should know about COVID-19 is right up his street. So, welcome, Dr. Greaves. It's good to have you again.
Thank you. So I'll start by taking us back to a year ago to Wuhan, China, when we heard of the first report of COVID-19. This was a young ophthalmologist who was subsequently ostracized and harassed by the Chinese government. He himself went on to die shortly afterwards. And now we are 1 year ahead, and things are quite a bit different. I just want to say a little bit about the coronaviruses, give you a little bit of background. This is a large family of viruses that cause respiratory and other infections in people and animals. These viruses mutate easily, and they can cross over from animals to infect people. And we know that bats serve as their reservoir. There are 7 coronaviruses we know of that infect human beings. 4 of these cause a common cold, accounting for about 15% of the cases. And there are 3 that cause SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. And that's what I'll be spending much of the time speaking about. In fact, this next slide shows the 3 SARS coronaviruses. The first one came to our attention in 2002, 2003. And as far as North America is concerned, it really centered around Toronto. Not too many cases. The next SARS coronavirus occurred in about 2012 in Saudi Arabia, the Middle Eastern region, hence the name MERS, or Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus. And then in 2019, we learned of SARS-CoV-2. And SARS-CoV-2, or SARS coronavirus 2, is the name of the virus, and COVID-19 is the disease that it causes. You are probably familiar with the key symptoms: fever and tiredness, a continuous cough, which is usually non-productive. Loss of taste and smell are fairly characteristic of COVID-19. And typically, with time, breathing difficulties develop. All this tends to start about 5 days from being exposed to someone who's infected. The good thing and the bad thing about COVID-19 is that 80% of people who are infected with the virus tend to have very mild symptoms or no symptoms. But then 15% can have clinical illness, and about 4 to 5% can go on to have very severe complications. Although we know more about the pneumonia and death from lung infection and respiratory problems, this virus is unusual and can cause complications outside of the lung. Here I just show you what can happen. we now know that some people can present for the first time with seizures because the neurological system is affected. Others can present with gastrointestinal symptoms like diarrhea and vomiting, and kidney disease, and many other areas. The problem, though, that usually kills people with this disease is acute respiratory distress. And in addition to that, sometimes there are complications of the heart attacks, blood clots, and so on. So this just shows you again the timeline of the illness with the first 5 days after exposure, things start, and then things can go downhill after the first week on towards the second week. But shortness of breath or dyspnea is a major problem. Now, we know that for those who become severely ill, 2/3 of them have some kind of risk factor. And the most common problem is that these are older individuals, typically 65 years or older, or people with chronic medical conditions, primarily diabetes mellitus, people with marked obesity, hypertension, and then to a lesser extent, chronic lung disease, immunocompromised patients, those with end-stage kidney disease or liver disease. But older age, diabetes, being overweight, and significantly overweight, and hypertension are real concerns. So this is what we want to avoid, being in hospital, being on a ventilator, because when things progress to this point, the return from this is not very high. Many people will go on to die if they have to go this far. So you don't want to go here. This shows what has happened, and the statistics vary over time, but in general, Black people have died at about 1.5 times the rate of white people. So this is a concern that we should have and try to avoid. And it's not only Blacks, but people of color in general. And here you see American Indians or Alaska Natives and Hispanics or Latinos and so on. This slide shows another important point, and it shows that the death rate increases as age increases. And so it's quite low below the age of 50. You can see it beginning to creep up from about 55. And this is true for both whites and Blacks, but the orange bars highlight Blacks. And you can see that at each age group, Blacks are more affected. So this shows not only the distribution and the fact that this increases with age, but also that at each age, just about, Blacks are more severely affected compared to whites and even Hispanics in this particular slide. So before I talk about a vaccine, I want to spend a minute about the immune system. And our immune system serves as the primary protection against invaders like bacteria, viruses, and against the SARS coronavirus too. And the immune system really is critical in terms of whether you'll be able to fight off this infection or whether you'll succumb or whether you'll have an illness that is not extremely severe, but in between. And there are several components to the immune system that I won't get into in detail. All that I would say is that the B cells are responsible for producing antibodies. The memory cells are what are very important if you should be exposed to the infection after the initial bout. And there are many other cells, like killer cells, that become involved. So this is probably the first case of someone being vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine in New York, but there may have been others who were before this, but this made the news. And it was a good picture to show. What I want to show you here is that the virus comes along, and our goal is to prevent the virus from attaching to cells. On our cells, particularly those in the lungs, they're what we call receptors. And these receptors specifically are known as ACE2 receptors. The vaccine comes along and it has its spikes, we call the spike protein, the little red knobs outside the virus. And these red knobs, if left unchecked, would come along and attach to the ACE2 receptors and enter the cell by that pathway. Our goal is to have antibodies get between the virus and these receptors so the virus cannot attach and enter the cell. There are many ways to produce antibodies. We can make them synthetically and give them You may have heard of monoclonal antibodies, and I'll show you a slide a little bit that explains it some more. We can have a vaccine that induces your body to produce the antibodies. And so there are different ways, but the goal is to have antibodies prevent this attachment. Now, the natural infection with a virus also will lead to production of antibodies if you survive. The problem with the natural infection is that the antibody response is very variable, and some people produce significant amounts of antibody, others don't. So it's not a reliable way to have antibody protection. Another way, though, to produce the antibodies is through vaccination. And there are several types of vaccines, and I'll talk about the three that are most common and where we have at least two types of them in the United States at the moment. But the vaccines elicit an antibody response to prevent infection or disease. And the good thing about the vaccines is that the vaccines induce our immune systems to produce a lot more antibody overall than you tend to get with the natural infection. Finally, as I said, we can just give the synthetic antibody. Over here is monoclonal antibodies, or we can take the plasma from people who've already been infected and who recover and who did well, and concentrate that plasma and give to those who may be infected. This is very laborious and time consuming, so it's not a method that we prefer. Now, there are three types of coronavirus vaccines in development. And the one that you've heard a lot about is the messenger RNA virus. These are the vaccines made by Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech. We've recently had approval of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is here in the middle, which is a different kind of vaccine. We call this an adenovirus vector vaccine because it's using a virus that doesn't cause infection in humans. It's been modified to contain genes that allow for production of messenger RNA and the spike protein. And then the third method is where we actually give the protein itself. Remember, I said the antibody is a key component that we want to have to prevent the virus from attaching to the cells. So you can get to the antibody here by three types of vaccine pathways, if you will. And we don't have this particular type of protein-based pathway yet, vaccine that does it that way, which there's one called Novavax, which will be coming later. And this is the way this one works. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine works via the second pathway. The Moderna and Pfizer vaccines work here, where messenger RNA is injected, and that's what's in the vaccine, gets into your body. And this is like a recipe card, which then codes for production of spike protein in the body. The spike protein, as it's released into circulation into the blood, the body sees it as something foreign and reacts to it by producing the antibodies, and that's how it works. Now, you may have heard that people require 2 doses of vaccine, and this is true except for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which only requires 1 dose. And there's a reason for the 2 doses. The first dose of vaccine tends to produce a primary immune response. So you get some response, some antibody response, but it's not extremely high. And then after 3 to 4 weeks, in the case of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, there's a second exposure to the antigen or second vaccination. And this time there's a much stronger response. And this is what we aim to get. Now, vaccines can play different roles. Ideally, we want a vaccine that can produce the kind of immunity that protects us completely if we're exposed to the virus, in this case, SARS-CoV-2. But it's not common or usual for vaccines to be totally protective like this. There are very few in the history of vaccines. Measles is perhaps one exception. When you're vaccinated, that's it. Don't need anything else, and it stays with good immunity through the rest of your life. But more often than not, we talk about functional immunity, where if you're infected again, chances are you won't have full-blown disease. But if you do get to the point of having clinical illness, it won't be as severe as if you were never exposed, if there were no vaccination. Then there are those who might be infected but have no symptoms, yet we can culture the virus, let's say from the nostrils, but they never develop any fever, no fatigue, no illness. So functional immunity is the way that a vaccine can be effective, even if it doesn't protect you from the disease completely. And I'll talk about severe illness later and how some vaccines protect you against this, because that is really the important part. We're not as concerned if you're vaccinated and then you get sniffles or a little headache or fever. We are concerned that you don't develop severe illness requiring hospitalization or death. And the other point I'll make here is that immunity can be short-lived or long-lasting when vaccines are given. The influenza vaccines, you know, needs to be repeated on an annual basis. Immunity is not long-lasting. A vaccine for measles, for example, on the other hand, can be long-lasting. Now, we know that from history, the 3 SARS coronaviruses that I showed earlier and the 2 that preceded this one, we know that for the first virus, SARS, which occurred in the Toronto region, 2000, 2003, immunity to that viral infection lasted about 2 years. And then for the other virus, the MERS virus, lasted about 34 months. We don't know how long immunity will last for this particular virus, SARS-CoV-2, but it seems like it will be at least 6 months based on natural infection. So this kind of a cartoon slide just shows you what can happen, that antibody levels can decrease or wane with time. And so people may become infected. If they become infected, chances are the infection won't be severe, but there's no magic to the vaccine. It's working with your immune system. If your immune system is not strong to start with, you won't get a good antibody response. So we know that people who are obese, for example, we know that people who are having other illnesses or immunocompromised, cancer patients, for example, they don't do well. And the same thing for older people. The antibody response is not as robust or as good for as in a younger person. Now, I want to spend a little time on this slide talking about the vaccines that we have, the Pfizer, Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson or Janssen, and then about the AstraZeneca vaccine, which I think will be likely approved pretty soon, but which has engendered considerable critique and discussion. So the mRNA vaccines, like the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, showed extremely high efficacy, 95%, 94%, totally unexpected. The Janssen vaccine showed an efficacy of about 66 overall, but in the US study, it was 72%. The AstraZeneca vaccine, there was considerable controversy. The initial studies, the vaccine efficacy was about 70%, but that was based on combining totally separate trials, where in one case, the manufacturers in conducting the trial failed to give a full dose to about 1/3 of the patients in the study. So they got a low dose plus a high dose, 1/3 of the patients, and the other 2/3 got the full dose. Interestingly enough, and strangely enough, the efficacy was higher in those who got the half-strength dose, followed by the full strength compared to those who got the full dose. So there's a lot of discussion about that, and I won't go into all the details right now, but suffice it to say, right now, as they're trying to get emergency use authorization in the United States, they have provided data from the current studies in the US and in Latin America, and there was discussion about what the efficacy actually is. Now they've settled on a 76% efficacy in the United States. The AstraZeneca vaccine was also tested in South Africa, and there it did not do well at all, 22% efficacy. And as a result, the South Africans are not using that vaccine because of the mutants that are there, and that's why. I'll talk about the mutants in a little while. In contrast, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in South Africa did better, 57%, against those new variants that are difficult. The key point I want to make from all the data on this slide is that we're really interested in looking at how these vaccines protect against severe disease or against hospitalization and death. If you focus then on those columns, you will see that protection for severe disease or for hospitalization and death is very high for all the vaccines. So there's really no reason at the moment that we should say, based on efficacy, that you can't take any of these vaccines. If you start looking at, little things here and there, then you can find room to, complain or critique. But these are the areas that we really want to focus on. They all require 2 shots, except for the Johnson or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's made by the Johnson subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. Initially, Pfizer had to be stored at minus 70 degrees. They've modified things so now it can be stored at minus 20, but still the easier ones to store are AstraZeneca and Johnson. And so these are important for, say, countries in the tropics and lower and middle income countries. The side effects are quite similar, but what it appears that at the moment, the side effects from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine might be a little bit less severe than for the messenger RNA vaccines. AstraZeneca vaccine has had quite a drubbing in Europe where there was concern about blood clots. In the end, the WHO and the UK health authorities and others have concluded that although there were blood clots, the incidence of these blood clots was no different than in the background rate in the general population. So it seems as though it's going to be okay. And even in the independent data safety monitoring board that complained about AstraZeneca using the higher figure for the efficacy, they did not find any issues with safety. The other interesting thing about the AstraZeneca vaccine is that they've also looked at a longer interval between the first dose and the second dose. And in fact, it's now recommended that the second dose be given 8 to 12 weeks apart, and they seem to get a better response with that gap or that distance between the doses compared to the 2 doses 4 weeks apart, which they tried initially. A little bit unusual, but that's what the data show. So I just want to talk a little bit about safety findings, what we've seen, particularly different mRNA vaccines. We know that there are allergic reactions, and if you had stopped the vaccine rollout after the first few doses in London when the Pfizer vaccine was given, and those 2 anaphylactic reactions occurred, we would never have any more vaccines. So I'm glad that people persisted. We know that anaphylaxis is a recognized complication of vaccines, and the key is to be prepared if you have history of allergy. And in this case, these individuals had a history of allergy, and in fact, they were walking with their epinephrine kits, so it's fine. We now know that overall, as millions and millions of doses have been given in the United States and around the world, that anaphylactic reactions are really quite rare, about 2.5 per million doses for the Moderna vaccine, and 4.7 for the Pfizer vaccine. This is the reason they asked you to wait 15 or 30 minutes after your vaccination, just to be sure, because if it is going to occur, this is when it tends to occur. Another finding that has been noted after vaccination is enlarged lymph nodes, what we call lymphadenopathy, under the axilla or armpit area. And this is important, not that it means anything bad, it goes away, but it just reflects the activity of the immune system, which is activated because of the vaccine as your body is trying to respond. But for women who are having mammograms, this is important to either wait until it goes away or let your radiologist or whomever know, because it could be mistaken to think that this is something related to breast cancer when it isn't. There's a condition referred to as Bell's palsy, which is kind of temporary facial paralysis, typically on one side of the face. And it was seen a few cases in the Pfizer vaccine, 4 cases among the vaccine recipients and none in the placebo group. And for Moderna, 3 in the vaccine group, 1 in the placebo group. The point here, though, is you have to look at what the background rate is and how often it's occurred. There are people who will jump to conclusions and say, well, look, oops, nope. But in fact, we know that 40,000 cases occur annually, and there's no real relationship to vaccines that have been used in the past. And we see it without vaccines, we see it with some vaccines. But I just bring it to your attention. There's a lot of questions about what's in the vaccine. There's all the craziness about chips in the vaccine. You're getting about 0.5 of a cc as a dose. I don't know where a chip will live in such a small dose being given into you. But we know that's just rubbish. But just to dispel the idea, this is what is in the vaccines, and these are basically salts and sugars and the actual messenger RNA recipe. Now, there's a new concern on the horizon, and these are the coronavirus variants. And variants represent changes in the virus that have several mutations, not just one mutation. The virus mutates all the time. It doesn't mutate as rapidly as, say, influenza virus or HIV virus, but there are little mutations here and there. But the surprising thing is that recently, well, I say recently, with the last several months, in 3 distinct geographic areas, in Brazil, South Africa, and in the UK, we saw the appearance of these variants with several mutations occurring at one time. We know that the UK mutation um, is more infectious, it spreads more easily. We know that the South African mutation is a bit more troublesome, and that's the one that we're more concerned about. And it's very similar to the one in Brazil, in that not only maybe it may be a little bit more infectious, but the antibodies that are produced in response to the vaccines don't seem to be quite as effective. And this is why we saw that the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccine didn't do as well in South Africa where those viruses were present. Now, we can't compare vaccines to vaccines exactly, because when the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine were being tested, these variants had yet come onto the scene. But we are watching them because it may mean having to tweak the vaccines. And in fact, the manufacturers are already doing that, may require a booster or may require modification of the vaccine next time we are dosed with a vaccine. So these are things to keep in mind as we go forward, but no real cause for alarm at the moment. So there are still some unanswered questions and concerns that we have. How long will immunity last after vaccination? We don't know for sure. Some suggest it will be about a year. We are pretty confident it will last at least 6 months, and it could be even longer than a year, because protection doesn't only depend upon the antibody level, but it depends also on the memory cells that I alluded to. We don't know for sure if the vaccine will prevent asymptomatic infection. We think they will, but studies are on the way to make this clearer. The long-term safety, we don't know yet. We know that the vaccine was safe during the period of time where the trials were conducted. And up until now, we think they're quite safe. But long-term efficacy will be longer. So we just have to monitor people who have received the vaccine to know for sure. The vaccine studies did not allow children or pregnant women or immunocompromised persons. So we don't know for sure how they will react. There are no studies that have started in children to be able to address this. People are looking at pregnant women as well. And we know that some women became pregnant during the studies and they did well. So we think there's not a problem. Immunocompromised persons, we don't have a lot of data on that at the moment. We don't know what it means if you miss the second dose of vaccine. For the Pfizer and Moderna studies, 2 doses were given to achieve the 94, 95%. Suppose you took only 1 dose, how good would be your protection? It's not clear, but it seems to be quite high, in fact. We know from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is quite high. And we still don't know for sure the efficacy against the new mutant strains of the virus, other than the studies in South Africa where we saw the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. But these are issues that need to be addressed. And of course, we're struggling to deal with the persistent myths and misinformation that occur. People have asked, how come these vaccines were developed so quickly? Are they safe? And I just want to make the point that although it looks as though they were developed so quickly, work on messenger RNA as a platform for vaccines began right about the time of the initial SARS outbreak in 2003. By the time, though, all the work was done, that outbreak did not last for a long time and the vaccine was never tested, but a lot of the work was done. So when it was possible to construct the genetic structure of the virus with this new virus, scientists were working furiously to be able to develop a genome, develop a vaccine, and to be ready to go testing this time around. And again, typically with outbreaks, they're small, but because this was a pandemic and there are so many cases, it's a lot easier to get trials up and moving quickly. And while we like to see 10,000 participants or so in the trial, I think we can feel pretty comfortable now looking at all the different vaccines and the number of people who've been tested. Between the Pfizer and Moderna studies alone, we're talking of over 70,000 individuals. So it didn't take us long to enroll because of these large numbers. And again, FDA and other regulatory authorities recognize that because this is a pandemic and because last year around this time, we didn't know really what was happening. It was so bad. Everything was rushed and made to happen more easily and quickly. and FDA facilitated the whole development process so that some steps could be done in parallel rather than in sequence. And then, of course, there was massive funding to encourage manufacturers to become involved, because typically vaccines are not the kind of things that many companies become involved in, because you prevent the illness and that's it. But this was such a dire situation that, again, there had to be some jump starting of the development process. But its safety was not compromised. There were requirements for independent data safety monitoring boards for each of the vaccine trials. And in addition, as you know now, the FDA refused to even look at the data until at least half of those who were vaccinated were followed for a minimum of 2 months. And you may say, well, why just 2 months? Because we know from history that vaccine reactions, when they occur, tend to occur within that framework. And while it would have been good to have waited for a year or more, if we had done that, given the thousands of people that were dying every day, it just seems as though that would be an unconscionable thing to do. But there's a lot of mistrust, distrust, and misinformation around, both mistrust and distrust in the government, healthcare providers, and pharmaceutical companies. And then there's misinformation, which is rampant on places like Facebook and on WhatsApp. And it seems as though every other person suddenly thinks that they're an expert and that they're the ones to be listened to, whether or not they have any medical knowledge. I want to spend a minute talking about a particular situation, though, for African Americans, and much of this is valid. And I say this is valid, but I don't say this to mean that we should sit and wallow in what happened in the past. I think we need to recognize that this happened. It was horrible. There have been many steps that have been taken to prevent this from happening, but this is a legacy that is there, and we can't just dismiss. And some people are stuck here, and I can understand that, but I will still encourage them to move on. One of the most dastardly things I would say, and many of you may not know about this, but one of the most famous physicians in the history of obstetrics and gynecology is this guy, James Marion Sims. And what he did was to conduct some of his experiments on Black women without any anesthesia. I mean, horrible and painful manipulations, developing his various techniques. Then there was a Tuskegee syphilis study. It was really a US Public Health Service study conducted in Tuskegee. It wasn't a Tuskegee study, but this was a study of men with syphilis, about 600 men they were following. And even when penicillin became available, and they should have received penicillin, those conducting the studies chose not to do it. There's an excellent movie called Bad Blood that you might want to take a look at sometime if you want to follow up on this. And then there's the other case of Henrietta Lacks. And from her, we get the abbreviated term HeLa from the first 2 letters of her first and last name. HeLa cells are used commonly in research even today, because these cells taken from her cancer, cervical cancer, were found to be unusual. They can replicate themselves. And this is a very important point for being able to propagate cells in the laboratory for much medical research. And for a long time, nobody knew anything about what was done, and no compensation. And then finally, there are other medical problems that we have today. Many cases we look at the healthcare system, and Blacks seem not to be treated ideally or as well as white folks. And I won't go into all the details, but you can just see, and it really spreads throughout. Even as Black medical professionals, many of us as Black physicians and nurses, we are sometimes treated as if we are orderlies or people who can't be physicians or can't be healthcare workers. Still exists in our healthcare system today. But this is just a caution to avoid jumping to conclusions, and that we must weigh the evidence, and not to make the fallacy or fallacious assumption just because one thing is associated with another, it means that one thing causes the other. It's not that simple. And that can be a really destructive way of thinking. Also, when we hear of events occurring, like the blood clots with the AstraZeneca vaccine, or as I'll show you in a minute, someone alluding to deaths, one needs to look at the background rate of whatever it is that's happening to be able to compare that to what the rate is in those say who were vaccinated. So relative risk is important, and the background rate is important. I mention this because there is something known as VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. This is a program conducted by the CDC and FDA together to monitor and collect reports of adverse events occurring after many things, including vaccines, drugs in general. And anyone can report a case, and this is monitored by CDC and FDA. Of course, it depends on voluntary reporting. It's not as good as the independent data safety monitoring boards that were required for the trials, but here it is. But this is what has happened. Some individuals who are bent against the vaccine have posted things like this online. And this is just a search that I did myself a few days ago. And here is what it shows. It does show for the Moderna vaccine, 845 events reported. And here I'm searching for deaths that were reported after this vaccine, and 793 for Pfizer. So you may hear someone say, 1,638 people died after taking the vaccine. Does that mean it caused the vaccine? All this is a collector for monitoring the cases that have occurred afterwards. Now, if you drill down into this, you can go look at their ages, you can look at what they may have had, what location, and you can go search it yourself. Anyone can search it. And so you can draw your own conclusions as to what may have happened. And the folks who've made this system want to make it clear that reports to the various system do not mean a true adverse event or reaction to a vaccine. The temporal association of two things does not necessarily mean one caused the other. And up until now, up until today, it can change. The CDC has yet to report any deaths related to the COVID-19 vaccine. In other words, any deaths caused by the COVID-19 vaccine. So things can happen that get reported, but up until now, and I said this can change anytime, there are not any deaths reported that have been considered to be caused by the vaccine. But there are medical professionals even who are spreading conspiracy theories about COVID-19, physicians and nurses. And I would say to you, always check the source of information you receive. Do not rely on posts on Facebook or WhatsApp or other social media platforms. Stop and check the source of what you're reading before you repost it or pass it on. There are false rumors about vaccines saying that they're causing infertility in women. This is completely false. Studies show no notable similarity with the spike protein and the protein that they're alleging in the placenta that antibodies will attack. In fact, antibodies taken from women with COVID-19 show no reaction to that very protein. And there are also no reports so far of infertility among the women who recover from the natural COVID-19 disease or those who were pregnant and were vaccinated during the clinical trials. Of course, there are not a lot, but we haven't had any problems so far, heard of anything about infertility, either from the natural infection or vaccine. And the women who have conceived during the vaccine trials, the infants have been normal. Then there's this pharmacist who felt like, I don't think this Moderna vaccine is safe for people. And rather than keeping it refrigerated, left it outside. So basically, it was of no use. It's one thing not to agree, but to engage in such acts is really not good. And then, of course, we aren't getting any help from the hip hop artists with their songs, denigrating vaccines. We're not even getting any help from the religious community. And this is from Christianity Today. There's among churchgoers lots of conspiracy theories that are considered true, and the gullibility is really a problem. This was nice to see, though. Jamaican Adventist theologian really went out of his way to say that COVID vaccines are not the mark of the beast, when others were trying to kind of perpetuate this myth within his setting, church setting. Then there's a nurse in Tennessee who alleged that she got Bell's palsy from the vaccine. And, she gave her name and everything else. And then when we fact checked this, found to be totally false. No such person, no one existed. So this is just another of those things that you see in social media. Here's another one in social media, making all these allegations that really, some of them make no sense, but some were mixed with a little bit of truth, which makes it hard when people mix the counterfeit, a little bit of truth, but mostly false. Then there's political interference. Here is the Tanzanian president, he was totally against the existence that there's even a coronavirus pandemic. And now, he just died, of course, but now they're really in a bad position, trying their best to catch up and to make the best before things get worse in Tanzania. Same thing in Brazil. Here's another one. He was lucky enough that he got COVID-19 and he survived. But Brazil is really in extremely bad shape right now, and largely due to this kind of political interference. And of course, we've got the anti-vaxxers. And I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't want to be vaccinated is an anti-vaxxer. That's not at all what I'm saying. There are reasonable people who have concerns and who want to be cautious. But then there are those who, for no reason and no scientific basis, are just totally against vaccination. And this, she has her gun, she has her sign, the tests are rigged, the death count was false. But let's stop for a minute and say, what if you don't want to take the vaccine? Is there anything else? Well, yeah, we do have some treatment options. There's an antiviral drug known as remdesivir that we can use. It's not a great drug, but it helps a bit. Then there are what we call monoclonal and polyclonal antibodies, but these you have to take before you become very ill. Otherwise, again, they don't work. And they're not easy to administer. They're given intravenously and only in special centers. We tried convalescent plasma taken from those who recovered. This hasn't been working that well, and the jury's still out whether or not this is going to be truly useful or not. But the most impressive therapy we've got so far is an old drug, old steroid called dexamethasone. And this has been pretty helpful. Now, there's some new drugs on the way that are being studied, which I won't discuss right now. But I do want to mention one last thing. There are some therapies that appear promising, but have not yet been proven effective for COVID-19 in randomized clinical trials. In other words, they look good, but the scientific data is not strong or not there yet. And one such important agent is vitamin D, and vitamin D3 in particular. And so I encourage people to get their blood level tested. And if it's less than 30 nanograms per ml, really consider being on vitamin D, unless there's some other reason why you shouldn't be on it. But in many studies, the levels of vitamin D in those who've developed severe COVID has been low. Vitamin D levels tend to be lower also in people with dark skins, like people like ourselves. So there are things to do, and it's pretty innocuous. And I think it's something quite reasonable. There are some scientific studies that are now underway, and I'm hopeful that they will show what some of us are thinking, that this really is very important. And then there are other things to help your body in general, your immune system, get enough sleep, regular exercise, but not excessive exercise, which can do the opposite. Good nutrition, avoid or limiting alcohol, managing chronic diseases, particularly diabetes and hypertension, and of course, weight. And then, follow the usual things, strict face distance and hand hygiene recommendations. So where are we going? When are we going to get back to normal? Don't know yet. A lot depends on the new variants, how that works out. A lot depends on how many people choose to be vaccinated. A lot depends on how people tend to follow the public health guidelines. So I'll stop here, turn it back to the moderator, and we can address some of your questions.
Thank you, sir, for this excellent presentation. We have a few questions in the chat and some others we received before. We'll begin with this one. What is herd immunity? And can you describe it?
Yeah. So herd immunity refers to the condition where the majority of people in a given population or community or setting are immune to the virus. And this immunity can come about either having been infected before and having recovered, or developing immunity based upon a vaccine. So let's say you've got a population of 100,000 people. You'd want to get, from what we have predicted based on this virus, you want to have about anywhere between 75% and 90% of them immune. So in a 100,000 population, you're talking about, getting 90,000 people immune, or 80,000, either through vaccination or vaccination plus the fact that some are already infected. And what this does, the whole rationale behind herd immunity, is that if a few cases occur, it would never create a sustained outbreak of a large number of cases because so many people would be immune. And so that's the concept. It doesn't mean that there won't still be a few cases here and there, but what it means is that it will never become an explosive outbreak.
Okay, thank you, sir. Here's one. By using the RNA and the DNA as the base for the vaccines, aren't humans meddling with the prerogatives of God?
Okay, fair question. But let me explain how it works. There are two kinds of vaccines we were talking about when we say RNA and DNA. The RNA vaccines are the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. In those vaccines, what we're doing is we've synthetically made messenger RNA, which is like, think of it as a note, a letter with a recipe, let's say to make a cake. And we're taking that recipe, it goes into the cell. The cell has two, think of it simplistically, two chambers, an inner chamber and an outer chamber. The outer chamber is what we call the cytoplasm. The inner chamber is the nucleus. The messenger RNA comes in, it goes into the cytoplasm. It cannot get into the nucleus. So it never gets into your DNA. It cannot alter DNA. All it's doing is carrying a message to the body to say, here, immune system, make these proteins. And the body says, okay, and I'm going to react to it and produce antibodies. So it's not giving you anything new to get into your system. It doesn't get into your DNA. The DNA vaccines are a bit different. The DNA vaccines, what we do is that we alter some of the genes of that virus. In this case, adenovirus is what we're using. So it can no longer multiply. What we do then is have that part that we change code for production of the messenger RNA, which then goes on to produce the spike proteins. But we're not interfering with your own cell. Your own cell and your own cell DNA is untouched. So no, we're not playing God and messing with your DNA and your cells. That's unchanged.
Thank you, sir. Now, how are you saying it is safe to take the vaccine when there are thousands of death cases from the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine reported on the CDC website? Can you please explain that?
Right. So that's what I just tried to show. If you go to that website, sure, you can find the deaths, but it is not saying that those deaths were caused by the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
That is a big difference. And people who don't understand causality and association will make that fallacious conclusion and jump. As I said, on CDC's own site, it makes the point that none of them have been considered at this point in time to be related to the vaccine. Of course, if they find cases where they can relate it to the vaccine, they will have to change their tune. But at the moment, those are the data. So it is wrong to be posting stuff and saying, because there are 1,200 or 1,400 or 1,800 deaths, that these were caused by the vaccine. Big, big difference.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Hi, Dr. Greaves. Given that the vaccine was not tested beyond 3 or 4 months, is there a major concern for the possibility of adverse effect in the long term or in the long run? Since that is the case, on what basis would the government seek to vaccinate the entire population when there's no guarantee of long-term safety?
It's a fair question, but there's never any guarantee of long-term safety when we have a new drug or a new vaccine or whatever. The reason why this is important is because we are in a pandemic. If we were just talking about a few cases in the United States across the whole nation, no one would be talking about rushing to look at a vaccine after only limited data. Of course not. But this is a situation of urgency, and so it requires action. And what FDA has done, they weren't totally callous about it. As I said before, we know from historical studies and clinical trials of vaccines that most vaccine reactions tend to occur within the first 2 months if they're going to occur. The other reactions that are rare are truly rare. And you probably won't even see them after a year or two. We're talking after millions and millions of doses, truly rare events. So I think we have to recognize that what FDA did was to try to compromise in the setting of a pandemic when thousands of people were dying every day. It would be unreasonable to go for a year before saying you could use the vaccines. And notice what FDA did. FDA has not given carte blanche to these vaccines. They have given what they call emergency use authorization. To be fully approved, these vaccines need to be reviewed again by FDA. I believe it's 2 years of data before they will get full approval. So they're only being allowed to be used right now because of this emergency situation, just like some of the tests that we're being allowed to use. So I hope that sheds some light. We don't have long-term data, that's true, but data is being collected all along. And you see, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the independent data safety monitoring board called them out and publicly basically told off the company, look, you are not using the most recent data. And they had to go back and analyze their data. So it was a good thing. They are being monitored. So I don't want anyone to think that these companies and that the data isn't being monitored closely. It is being monitored very closely. And this is why we know about the blood clots. This is why we know about all the other things that are going on. So I think what is being done is not at all unreasonable. Okay, it's not perfect, but this is not a perfect world. And if we were not to have these vaccines at all, I don't even think that we would be in the position where we're in right now, where we've got some decrease in the cases. And in the UK, for example, they've had a dramatic increase. They've vaccinated a lot more people than we have in the United States. So I think we have to be considerate.
Okay. Is it true that the cells or DNA of a fetus was used as the basis for the vaccine?
Okay. Yes and no. Viruses need to live in cells, which is why I like the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, because they are made differently. The vaccines that use the DNA of viruses, like the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, for the virus to be propagated, to have enough virus to make the vaccine, the cells are growing, the viruses are growing in cells. As it turns out, fetal cells, embryonic fetal cells, are an excellent source for the virus to be able to grow and propagate itself. Just like I talked about those HeLa cells in Henrietta Lacks, which we use for different things in science. As it turns out, embryonic fetal cells are a good source, if you will, to be able to propagate the virus, to have it grow. But after the virus is grown, that is removed from all the cell structure and cell material through a purification process, so that by the time the vaccine is made, there is no longer any trace of fetal embryonic cells. Now, that doesn't satisfy some people because those cells were used. Now, these cells, mind you, we aren't using cells that are coming from fetuses every day. These are cells that are propagated. We call them immortal cell lines. And this is pretty standard in laboratory practice. So it doesn't mean we're taking cells from fetuses every day, just to be clear. But what it does say is that, yes, those kinds of cells were used to propagate the virus to get to the point to make the vaccine. But then the vaccine is purified. Those cells are no longer in the vaccine. Now, there are some religious groups, some Catholic groups in particular, I know, who have suggested that their parishioners not use those vaccines unless nothing else is available. And so there is that discussion. So I just want to make that distinction that there has been use of those cells to make some of the vaccines, the DNA vaccines, but not the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccines, the mRNA vaccines. But that in the actual vaccine, when it's administered to you, at that point, those cells are no longer there.
Thank you, sir. Now, if you take the vaccine and die, is there compensation for your family?
Yeah, there's a compensation, but it's not from the vaccine manufacturer. The way it's set up in the United States, and it's different in different countries around the world, is that there's a specific system set up to manage vaccine compensation. So there is, but it's not from the vaccine manufacturer. And this is another myth that's gone around that, you won't be compensated. There's compensation, but it is not from the vaccine manufacturer. That's true. The government handles it.
Okay. Um, could herd immunity be obtained without a vaccine?
It is potentially possible, but so many people will die first. That is not a thing that we want to encourage. Sweden had the smart idea to do that. And for a while, they were not using any controls. They figured we'll get immunity naturally. Didn't work. Now they're vaccinated like crazy, and many, many people have died. So it makes no sense to try that approach. I will be categorical and say that. Theoretically, it sounds good, but to allow so many people to die just to have your natural herd immunity doesn't seem logical or wise.
Okay. The CDC says that deaths are not caused by association with the vaccine. Should that not be concerning? If there was a product out there with deaths associated with it, would the FDA pull that product?
So here, I'm not sure what a person's asking, but let's put when a report is made to theirs, as much information is gleaned as is possible. And in fact, CDC is investigating several deaths. The point is that for many deaths, many people die naturally every day. And so it makes it difficult to be able to conclude that something is causal unless there's a bit more information. So I don't think they're not trying to just gloss over it. I think at some point we may find some cases where it is causally related. As I said, we can only speak for what things are like right now. I think the danger is in going from one extreme to saying that these are all caused by the vaccine because they're reported, as opposed to looking more deeply into why they died. For example, the case of Norway. I don't know if you may have heard the Norway case in old people's home, where a number of people died, and there was a lot of concern at first. And then when there was a deeper investigation, it was found that many of these individuals were very old, very frail. Some of them were actually at death's door, if you will. I'm missing the word I want to use for when people are being monitored at home. Hospice equivalent. I mean, so everything needs to be investigated, and there are cases that are still being investigated, So I think we may have an update anytime, which is why I said this is just as of today, where some people may have died and the cause may change. At the moment, we can just say that it's not clear cut. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened or it can't happen. It doesn't mean that either. So I'm not trying to say that either. It could well be true that some of the cases weren't properly reported, but we don't want to jump the gun. We just want to have good data to be able to address.
Okay. What advice do you have for those who have had the COVID with regards to the vaccine? Do they need to take it?
Right. So in the clinical trials, people were vaccinated who had COVID. The current recommendation from CDC, however, is not to become vaccinated if you have COVID infection. Wait until it clears up. And some recommend waiting 90 days. I feel very strongly about this, that if you have any inkling that you have COVID now, don't get the vaccine until you recover, because I'm concerned about overloading your immune system when it's trying to get rid of the virus and you go get the vaccine at the same time. So I would say, yeah, let's stick what CDC is saying and don't go be vaccinated if you have active infection. However, once you recover, I do recommend getting the vaccine for this reason. As I said earlier, your antibody response to the natural infection is not as high as after the vaccine. And the higher the response, we think, the longer your protection or immunity. So there's good reason to still get the vaccine if you've had COVID, but not during the active phase.
Thank you. The information is circulating that one of the sources from which the ingredients of the vaccine originate is pork. Is there any truth to this?
I don't know of any truth about that. The only things that, as I mentioned earlier, we use the cells from the fetal cells for the DNA vaccines. The other stuff, there's no need for pork. This is all synthetic stuff. So I'm not sure where that came from. Maybe it's a WhatsApp or a Facebook stuff, but I have no reason to believe that. Never seen that anywhere.
Okay. By the way, one of your former colleagues is on. I don't know if you see him. Dr. Al Thomas is on.
Oh, hi, Al. No, I didn't see him. Greetings.
Okay. Now, how would you describe the current state of the pandemic and changes since early 2020?
So since 2020, we've gone through a couple of waves, the initial wave, a summer wave, and then a Christmas wave. A lot of the waves being driven by people relaxing, protective measures too quickly, too soon. I'm hopeful that with a vaccine, even though people are beginning to not follow directions as stringently as they ought to, I'm hopeful that with the vaccination process going as well as it's going right now, that we won't see another big surge. And I'm really hoping and I'm hopeful that by end of summer, early fall, we can get back to a near normal. But this depends a lot. The elephant in the room right now is those variants. If those variants prove to be more difficult and more widespread, and we can't keep up, and if it keeps going on, we could be in a mess still.
Okay. Pastor Wright, do you have a question?
Well, I would just maybe ask if some of the information that we're getting that is negative is spurred by Russia or other people who have a lot to gain for this misinformation.
So I don't think Russia in this case, simply because they too are developing vaccines. And in fact, they've got at least one vaccine that looks pretty good. Some of the others I'm not so sure about. So I think the misinformation, it's possible still, but I'm not as convinced because of what I just said, because why would they even bother then to go through the whole process of vaccination, developing a vaccine, if they were the ones behind misinformation? I think a lot of the misinformation is coming from people who are in the anti-vaxxers group, from people who are afraid and just afraid, but reading the wrong information, and people are taking advantage of that. And I think also some of this has come from political leaders. They played a big role in perpetuating misinformation. I just gave you the example of Tanzania and Brazil. And Brazil is really sad in a way because in Manaus, in Brazil, an area where it looked as though there was herd immunity and they shouldn't have had a problem, that is the very region where we're now seeing the P1 variant, which is as bad as the South African variant. And it really worries you. And so when people can walk around setting such a bad example as leaders and, mouthing things that make no sense, I think that's where a lot of the misinformation is coming from. And so it's become more of a political badge more than anything else.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Melbourne, just one quick question. I think I should have been more specific with my question. The question actually was the information which I was talking about as misinformation was trying to discredit the products like Pfizer, Moderna, JJ, because they wanted to sell their particular vaccine. That's what it was.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a possibility.
I saw a news thing where it was said that was something to look for based on intelligence in this country. That's
okay.
all.
Yeah. So that's a possibility because the mRNA vaccines are new. So I could see them shooting darts at that, saying, well, it's new, don't take it. So that's possible.
Okay. Thank you. Where do you think this virus came from? Where did it really begin?
That's a tough question. I don't know that anybody knows the answer. It's funny though. I just noticed that one of my colleagues, well, a colleague from years ago when I was in Maryland, who was the ex-CDC director, he's now saying that he thinks it came from a laboratory in Wuhan, but he is saying that he thinks that it was a mistake, an error, and not deliberate. So, the initial explanation, honestly, never made a lot of sense to me about a Wuhan market. So I find it very hard to accept that myself. But then at the same time, I've talked to many, many scientists and virologists who know a lot more about this stuff than I do. And they don't seem to think that it is something that was engineered. However, what I find very distressing is that the WHO, in its recent attempt to investigate the origins of the vaccine, really weren't able to do very much because they weren't given the kind of access that they were expecting from the Chinese to really get to the bottom of it. So while it is probably not necessary to invoke the theory that this is something man-made or genetic, because as I told you, many, many of these viruses, similar viruses, exist in the wild in bats. We know that. There are many, many coronaviruses, and they're the reservoir. So we don't have to invoke the theory that this was genetically engineered. But at the same time, I am very dismayed, yes, that there wasn't a more thorough investigation of that laboratory when the WHO personnel went there. So I don't know if we'll ever know the truth.
Okay.
May I ask a question?
Here's one. Please put your question in the chat. Thank you. Here's one. There's a doctor in, I think it is Ghana, who came up with the notion that hydrogen peroxide, if used to gargle, can use to cure or prevent the vaccine. And there was even a publication in the English Journal of Medicine on it. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. We've seen so many studies talked about. We've seen hydroxychloroquine being touted even by our ex-president. There are many, 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 many things that have been looked at. So here's what we do in science to avoid some of this. We like to see what we call randomized controlled trials, meaning that we have an arm, we have more than one arm. We don't just look at 100 people who were treated or 20 people who were treated and they did well because they took or because they used hydrogen peroxide mouthwash. We want to look at a study that would say, divide the group in half use the mouthwash, half don't. Let's see what really happens. And not only that, we need to see it repeated, corroborated by totally independent groups elsewhere, not your friends, maybe in another country. That's the kind of comparison we want. If you then find data, we want to see it published in a reputable journal, not the English Journal of X or whatever. There are certain well-recognized standards in clinical research where publications go to be published, thoroughly reviewed. Sometimes they get retracted because people feel that it wasn't done properly. That's the level of research we want to see before we endorse a compound. And so there's so many things that have fallen by the wayside. As you know, hydroxychloroquine, based on that one paper in France by the French investigator, looked terrific. And so people were desperate. There was nothing else. So start to use it. But then folks said, well, I'm using it, but I'm not seeing that good results. We better look at this thing more carefully. And so other groups start to look and look and look and look. And now we know it's been discredited. So I don't know what hydrogen peroxide really does. I can't say it's a good thing if you just want to do a mouthwash, but does it do anything for COVID-19? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I think they said they did use the placebo, but in terms of whether or not it was used beyond those immediate ones, I do not know. Okay, next question. All along, we were told the virus is spread by droplet transmission or touching infected objects or surfaces. But now we are hearing about airborne transmission. What should we believe?
That's quite true. In the beginning, we assumed wrongly that this was a virus that was transmitted like the cold or like influenza, mostly through droplets. And I think also we didn't realize that there was so much asymptomatic spread. This is a strange virus. And so we have had to adjust our thinking as knowledge has accrued. And I know that people will criticize scientists for that, but that's the best we can do. As you get more knowledge, you can't keep your head in the sand. You have to address the fact that, look, this is real. It can be hanging around in the air. And we also learned that while hand hygiene and surface hygiene is good, that is not the most important mode of spread of the virus. Nowhere near like what we thought at first. And so the air is really the critical thing for this virus. But yeah, it was I don't want to say it's a misstep, but it's one of those things that happens in science. As your knowledge increases, you have to modify your message. I know it's hard for people to understand, but that's just the sad reality of life.
Mm-hmm. While you're there, not much is said publicly about the fact that it's a the virus can travel through the eyes. You want to say something about that? Is there truth to that?
Well, I don't want to say that it can travel through the eyes, but we know that the eyes can be an area that can be infected, and thereon it can get into your body. But again, that is also not a major route of transmission. So I don't want that to take precedence of our attention to the air and ventilation and wearing a mask. And certainly to be fully protected, yes, wearing goggles or eye shield or glasses or something will help you. But in general, the air you breathe is still, from what we now know, the most important concern.
What about masks? At first, masks were discouraged. Now they are being encouraged. In fact, there's now talk of double masking.
Yeah, that
Whom
was.
do masks really help?
This is closer to being a misstep than just additional knowledge, because I always felt that it was silly to be saying that the mask only helps the other person and doesn't help you. Never made sense to me personally. But this was what CDC was saying. Of course, CDC was under a different administration then, not to cast too many aspersions, but I don't know if it was just the scientists saying that or others. Anyways, really, masks to me have always been important. And even if they weren't perfect, don't tell me that putting a mask over your nose wouldn't protect things from coming towards you at all. Come on. So now we've come to the point where we realize that wearing masks doesn't only protect the person beyond the mask, but it also protects you, particularly if you use a mask that's tri-layer or at least fairly thick, And now we're saying double masking, not so much because the double masking is itself the deal, but what it does to your nose so there's not leakage. Leakage is the issue. And that's the key reason for the two masks. In fact, if you're wearing one mask and it fits very well, you really don't need a double mask. That's actually the latest finding now. And I wouldn't be surprised if CDC modifies it to make it clearer. But if you can't do that, there's no harm in wearing both. But still, you need to be able to breathe.
Okay. The figures in the US seem to suggest that the virus affects the Black people disproportionately. Yet we are not seeing that level of severity in Africa or in the Caribbean countries. What do you think may be the reason for this?
That's another good question. That really is a bit of a puzzle. So I'll tell you what some people have suggested. I don't find any of it persuasive, but altogether it may help. So some are saying that the populations in developing countries tends to be younger than in, places like Europe, much older population on our region here. And so younger people tend to do much better, for example, and, they don't have as much hospitalization. That may be one thing. Others are saying that in developing countries, they're exposed to more infections and more pathogens. And so because the body's immune system has been primed, it's stronger and more able to resist the infection. Others are saying that because in many of those countries, they've received BCG vaccine, which many of those countries got for tuberculosis, that somehow also is an primary immune stimulant and has contributed. And then the other argument, which I think may have some validity because I'm a little bit biased, although I'm a scientist, is that vitamin D may be important. And where there's a lot of sunlight and being outdoors and you're not closed up and there's more space between where you move around, that too probably helps to be a factor in minimizing it. So, yeah.
Okay. Why is the infection and mortality rate so much higher among some people and groups?
So I think you're probably referring to people of color in the United States, blacks and so on. And so the thinking is that this is not something biologic. This is something more related to the social determinants of health, to things like where you live, to things like the job where you have. Many of Black folks, for example, are first responders, whether they're bus drivers, whether they're working in cafeterias, whether they're nursing assistants. A lot of Black folks are on the front lines. And so that can reflect it, but it also reflects the level of poverty, like I said, the places you live, the kind of healthcare you have. It also reflects the prevalence of certain diseases in our population, like diabetes, which is very rampant, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, smoking, and all the things that go with it. So it represents a constellation of health factors and not the biology. In fact, where you correct for those kinds of factors, then the rates aren't that different.
Okay. What do you think about churches and schools and the risk to worshipers, teachers, and others?
So churches and schools, the big risk there is being indoors and being in a closed space, and in a closed space with poor air circulation. So churches are a real concern because most churches in the US, unlike, say, in the Caribbean or other countries where you can just open your windows, most of our churches here are closed pretty much. We rely on air conditioning and those kinds of things. And so if you put too many people in there and one person or two is infected, you can have aerosols floating around for quite a while. So I'm very worried about churches. I think if we're going to go back to church, we really need to be very careful and thoughtful about how many people can go at a time, the kind of ventilation, and the kind of filtering or filtration systems that you're going to set up. Schools are a little bit different. Schools don't seem to be, and by the way, back to churches, there have been a number of outbreaks related to churches. So it's clear. People in the choirs, for example, in singing, there have been documented outbreaks. In schools, it's a bit different. And I'm not talking so much of high schools, but I'm talking about more kindergarten and elementary schools. Those kinds of schools, I'm a lot more willing to say there's a bit of flexibility in opening those back up, as long as you can have some kind of distancing and, again, ventilation, because it appears that spread from what we know among young kids, certainly those who are below 9 or 10, doesn't seem to be as significant. And there've really not been many serious outbreaks in that setting. So you see, CDC has now come out, I think mostly under pressure though, to say that with schools, they're willing even to go to distancing 3 feet apart versus 6 feet apart. So I think schools are probably going to be opening more and more.
Okay. I have two related questions. One says, is there still a notion that the 5G network rolled out is connected to COVID? Your thoughts, please. And the other one is similar, but it adds to that the idea of Bill Gates and these.
No, those are myths that have been debunked all over the internet. So it's not even worth discussing, other than to say, when SARS came out in 2003, they were talking about 3G networks. When the MERS virus came along in 2012, they were talking about 4G networks. Now it's 5G networks, So it's just all ridiculous nonsense, in my opinion, with no relevance to transmission of a virus that is airborne. I think there was someone, Dr. Melbourne, who you'd asked to put the question in chat. I don't know if he did.
You're muted.
You did?
He's Dr. Melbourne, you're muted.
Oh, okay, yeah. Thank you. Um,
Just
I
one.
think I've covered most of the questions in chat. Let's see here. Okay. So are you saying that the virus passes through the air, survives, so you can just step outside and get infected?
No, 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 not at all. In fact, I go riding whenever I can, and I go riding, and I basically don't wear a mask when I'm riding unless I'm very close to another person or going into a crowd. So it's not just the air. But what I'm saying is this: if you are in an area with other people and one person's infected, we now know that it's not just the droplets, which we were saying about 6 feet, but there are also smaller particles which you can emit in the air, coughing, sneezing, even talking, which are so small and light, they just circulate and persist in the air for hours, not indefinitely, but it can certainly be hours. And so if you come into that setting, then, and there's no ventilation and it just sits there, then you are potentially putting yourself at risk. Outdoors is a lot different, and particularly unless you're really, really close to someone outdoors, in a small setting, that's not something that I think you need to worry about.
Mhm. Okay. There are two questions from YouTube. One is, how can church leaders help? And the second one is, if you already have the antibodies for the virus, is there a need to have the vaccine?
Okay, church leaders can
Thank
help
you,
by
Karen.
yeah, church leaders can help by setting the right example, and a lot do, and some don't. There are churches that who defied the recommendations, the public health recommendations, and they've had to be, how should I say, visited by the cops. And there are others where they've been lucky nothing has happened, but there are other churches where church leaders have died. There are several church leaders who have died who flaunted their recommendations and who insisted that they were doing God's work and they were going to keep preaching. And they did keep preaching. And then they ended up 6 feet under. So it's a very, you know, arrogant behavior to engage in, to just ignore what's happening and to pretend that you don't need to do anything or follow any direction. So I would urge church leaders to be reasonable, be sensible, and set a good example, like you folks are doing here today, and not to um, pander to some of the myths and conspiracy theories around thinking that you're immune, and not to be presumptuous as well. That's the other thing I would say I find in our church population, this presumption that God will save you and take care of you even if you don't take sensible precautions. The second question has to do with, you've got antibodies because you were infected with COVID. Should you still take the vaccine? And maybe that person missed my earlier point that yes, you should still take the vaccine, but wait until you recover, because what the vaccine will do will be to give you a bigger antibody boost. And having a bigger antibody boost is likely to mean a longer period of protection or immunity, because the antibody response from the natural infection is not always anywhere as high as that you get from the vaccine.
Okay. Here's a question from uh, overseas, out of the country. Let's see.
Okay.
The question is saying, is asking whether or not we can wear a face shield without a mask.
Yeah, you can do that too. But again, if you want the best protection, you'll do both. So I know for some people, they just can't stand a mask. So wearing a face shield is better than wearing nothing. But ideally, you'd probably want to do both things.
Yeah. I was entering a building. I forgot my mask and I had the face shield on and they wouldn't let me in.
Yeah, well, some places are very strict because the face shield hasn't been studied as extensively as masks have been studied. And in the one study that I know of, it didn't work as well. It wasn't quite as protective as the mask. And again, a lot has to do with coming around the sides,
Yeah.
Ideally, you want to have something closer to your mouth and your nose.
Okay. Lots of people are skeptical about the vaccine, for example. What are the ingredients that make up these vaccines? And I think you may
I
have
covered
covered
that
some of
early
that.
on, but maybe
Yeah.
they missed it. But it's basically sugars, salts, And in the case of the mRNA, the actual piece of messenger RNA, there's no preservative in the messenger RNA vaccines. No mercury, nothing like that. So, you can go online and search the data for yourself, but there's really nothing to be worried about in that context about the content of the vaccines. It certainly doesn't contain any chips. You don't need to worry with that.
So it can't be the mark of the beast.
And it's not that either. But I think that if you're skeptical, I urge you to continue to search, find out, talk to people whom you trust, go to reputable sites and read for yourself. I understand that you may be reluctant, but I think that if you do your own research, I think you will come away with a better understanding, and you will probably see that this is not as unreasonable a thing to do as others might have led you to believe. But don't just listen to others.
Okay.
Talk to people whom you trust.
Mm-hmm.
And also use sources that you trust. And again, I say trustworthy sources are not social media sources. That's not their goal.
Okay. How do you think the pandemic will end? Do you believe a vaccine is our best hope, or a new drug, or will we have to keep wearing masks and keeping strict physical distance and limiting travel?
No, I don't think we can go on living like this, quite honestly, which is why I hope people will become vaccinated, because I would love to be able to travel and many people to go see their family elsewhere, and you can't, or you have to go and be quarantined. It's really not good. So I think the sooner we can get past this, the better. And I wish everyone would cooperate so we can do that. In any case, we can't make people become vaccinated, at least not right now. And so you need to think of protecting yourself. If nobody else wants to protect themselves, at least you need to consider taking care of yourself. I tell people, look, okay, you're so skeptical, you have all these concerns. Ask yourself first, how old are you? If you are older, I say 65 or older, your risk is very, very high. If you become infected with this virus, you might have severe disease. You might end up in hospital, end up on a respirator, and die. If you have a chronic medical condition of any age, if you're younger or older with a chronic medical condition, I talked about obesity, I talked about diabetes, and so on and so forth, you are also at grave risk. If you're young and you're even not at risk for any of those things, you need to ask yourself still two questions. Do you live with anyone who's older? For example, your parents. Do you work with people who are older? Do you realize that you can become infected and be perfectly fine and pass it on to them and they can die? I can tell you one family in our church right here in New Jersey where that happened. A member of the family, younger, came home, infected the older person, dead. Same thing with another family that I know in another setting. These things happen. So you want to ask those kinds of questions. And then finally, I say, ask yourself this question. Do you really want to live like this for the next 6 or 12 months or next year, where you need to wear a mask, where you can't travel where you want to travel, where you can't go to a restaurant? Do you really want to live like that? If you can say yes to all those questions, okay, I can't convince you. It's your choice. I'm just going to take care of myself and get the vaccine. But I ask you, think about these questions. Don't just pass it off and dismiss it.
Okay. We have been going for more than an hour and a half, and the interest has been sustained. On
Okay.
this platform, we have had up to 97. We now have 88. We don't know what's happening on Facebook and YouTube. I have two more questions. And if folks have other burning questions, they can put them in the chat. If not, I think we can close, because people are saying, and rightly so, this has been a very comprehensive presentation and they have learned a lot. This question says, my understanding is that the antibody boost that you get from the vaccine is directed only at the COVID infection and reduces your immunity to other infections. What's your comment?
Yeah, there's no basis in truth for that fact scientifically. the antibodies are directed against the COVID spike protein, like I showed. That's the whole point in the vaccine. But that does not interfere with your present antibodies to other viruses to which you're already immune. It doesn't mean that you still can't be protected if you're exposed to a new virus. There's no evidence whatsoever for that. So I would not worry about that at all.
Okay. You mentioned that there's sugar in the vaccine. The question is a sugar vaccine good for diabetes?
So I'm using the word sugar in a sense of a chemical structure, not sugar that you taste in your mouth that tastes sweet. I'm sorry. This is purely from a chemical structural standpoint. There are some compounds that are referred to sugars as salts, but no, it's nothing that tastes sweet and even so, it is such a tiny, tiny dose that would never affect your diabetes.
Okay. I heard that people can be reinfected. Will this vaccine prevent reinfection?
So that's a very good question. I'm glad that person raised it. Can you be reinfected even if you were vaccinated? And the answer is, unfortunately, yes, because the vaccine is not 100% protective. But let me hasten to say also that even if you had COVID, you can get it again because, as I said, the antibody response from natural infection is also not 100% protective. So there have been cases of reinfection among individuals who had the natural COVID-19 infection. And there are also cases of those who were vaccinated who became infected the second time. The good thing is that when you're infected the second time, because your body was already exposed to the infection, typically, there are exceptions, but typically that reinfection is not as severe as the initial infection. But yeah, nothing is perfect, so it can happen.
All right. There are several mutations, at least 3 major ones right now. Will the vaccine cover mutations?
Right. So just to reiterate what I said earlier, we know that for the UK mutation, the vaccines will cover it. For the South African mutation and the P1 mutation out of Brazil, the vaccines, we don't have good information for the P1 vaccine, but it's so similar to the South African variant. The vaccines don't do as well. They cover it, but not as well as they cover the current strain and the UK strain. So because of that, the vaccine manufacturers are already beginning to make a new vaccine, which may be a booster or maybe the next version if we need to have a vaccine anyway, if immunity goes after a year. But people are addressing that just to try to stay ahead of the virus.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. If there was a contraceptive vaccine, but after taking it, you still get pregnant, and you still have to wear a condom, would you still take it? And therefore, if you take the vaccine and you can still get COVID, why take the vaccine?
I love that question. So, first part, you still take it because if you get the infection again, it's not going to be as bad. That's a good reason to take it. That's very important because the chances are, first of all, very, very slim, that you're going to be reinfected. But if you are, the chances are that you'll get severe disease. You can see the data I showed earlier, or be hospitalized or die are really, really, really slim. So there's a reason to take it. Now, the business about wearing a condom or wearing a mask, that's the funny one. And, we don't think that you're going to have to wear a mask forever. If you're vaccinated, in fact, the current guidelines from CDC, they're beginning to relax the restrictions. If you're fully vaccinated, you can now meet with another family who's also fully vaccinated, keeping the groups not too large. So now, parents and children and grandchildren and so on who are all vaccinated, they can meet together. They don't need to be separate anymore. So I think what you're going to see is a gradual lessening of restrictions for those who have been vaccinated. I also think, I may be wrong, but I also think that the time is probably going to come. I know that the UK is thinking of already of the equivalent of, I don't want to call them vaccine passports, but if you can show that you've been vaccinated and you have antibody response, that you are going to be able to do things that those who can't show that won't get. I would not be surprised if some airlines start requiring that, honestly. You know, even now for yellow fever, if you're going to travel to an area where there's yellow fever, you can't go unless you get yellow fever vaccine. I know lots of folks are saying, but that's in place right now. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all, for the sake of getting commerce and travel back to normal, that those kinds of requirements come into place.
Okay.
So
I was going to say there's one dimension you miss. It's not between the condom and the mask. It's a condom and the vaccine. Why be vaccinated if you can be reinfected?
well, that's what I just said, though. The point is that if you become reinfected, it won't be as severe. That's very important. That's critical.
Yeah.
The idea here is to prevent severe disease, hospitalization, and death. Forget the little infections. So if you become reinfected, you want to know this time around, it was just the sniffles.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Greaves. We appreciate. Do you have a final statement?
So I would go back to those questions that I suggest that people ask themselves, particularly those who are still on the fence or skeptical. Do you really want to go on living like this? Do you think that you might just reconsider doing your role in helping us get to herd immunity, where everyone then can be able to move around because so many people are immune? Ask yourself if there are chronic medical conditions that you have that really would place you at serious risk. And do you want to take that risk? Ask yourself about your age. Ask yourself, even if you're a younger person, are there people whom you love, whom you live with, who might be at risk if you became infected? How would you feel if you were the one responsible for their death? Are there people in your workplace where the same thing could happen? And ask all those questions. Continue to listen, read, learn, rely on trusted sources, and make your decision if you're not yet vaccinated. That's what I would say to everyone who's listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greaves, for this very excellent presentation. It's been informative. We have learned a lot. And I think that if we put in practice what we have heard, we will go a far way to help counteract this pandemic. I would invite us to share what we have heard with others. And I think we may be able to access this information in the future on YouTube, since it was broadcast there. So on behalf of Collaborate to Educate Our Sons, and on behalf of Redemption Praise, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Until the next time, let us pray.
Amen.
Great God, we thank you for the information that has been given and for what we have learned. Help us now to go to put in practice that which we have learned for the betterment of ourselves, for the betterment of society, in order to help others to live. Give us the courage to do what we know is right and not that which is expedient, we pray. Amen.
Thank you.
Amen. That was well done. Thank you so much.
Amen. Thank you so much.
All right. I guess we'll stop streaming, and those who want to hang around a little to say hi to each other, I'll put it on gallery view so that we all can say, hey, hello, and thanks, and show our appreciation. And just want to mention that tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock, we'll be having our first of 7 last words of Jesus Christ. So please remember that every night at 8 o'clock, we'll be having the 7 last words. So it's going to be fantastic. We have great singers and so on. And our youth vibe, 6:30 on Monday. Looking forward to that. So let's all come out tomorrow night. It's good to see all of you. So I'm going to go to gallery view, Dr. Melbourne, and everybody can say hi to each other. There we go.
Pastor Raj, how are you?
Oh, fine, Pastor Casey. Dr. Melbourne, see your friend Casey Henry.
That's right. That's right.
And Dr. Greaves, it's great to see you from the Churchill Oranges. It's been a little while.
That's right. Good to see you. I saw your wife on too. How are you guys doing?
Doing good down here in DC, Maryland area. So, you know, the Churchill Oranges, are you still going? I think we saw you a couple years ago.
Yeah, I'm still there. I remember you used to play your sax. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That was a good band. That was one of the best church bands with Philip and all those Richard and all those guys.
Yeah. They've moved on now, Richard and Philip. Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Melbourne. That was an excellent session.
Yeah, the program was fantastic.
Hi, Dr. Gordon. So good to see you. I noticed you were here.
Yes.
How are things going in the ministry?
Quite well. We are trying. We are challenged, of course, by COVID in Jamaica because the spread is really uncomfortable, let me put it that way. And so we're trying our best. School, face-to-face school is out. So all our classes have to be online and, you know, the challenges that come with that as well.
Yeah,
But we're trying.
I hope the boys are faring well. I think about them.
We have been interrupted by the COVID-19 because we have to reposition the program. So we'll get in touch with you.
Okay.
Yes, we're working on that right now.
Okay.
Yes. It was really a great session. I think it's one of the most informative sessions I've been into concerning the vaccines.
Yes,
and really
Devon. Yes, Devon.
Thank you, Dr.
Stop.